Welcome to the Under 8 podcast, a 3 times per week college basketball show brought to you in under 8 minutes. At the time of recording, it is Sunday, April 7th, 6:41 p.m. My name is Josh Mullenix. On today's show, South Carolina perfection and UConn versus Purdue for the national championship on the men's side. It's all right now on the Under 8 podcast. Josh Doering here with me. It wasn't Caitlin Clark. It wasn't Paige Beckers. It wasn't Juju Watkins. It wasn't Cameron Brink. It wasn't throw any name in there that you want when talking about some of the more impressive individual performances of the 2023-24 women's college basketball season. It was perfection from South Carolina Gamecocks, from Don Staley's crew. Doing it basically how they've done it all season, just being a little too much for the team that they're playing against over the course of 40 minutes, 87-75 over the Iowa Hawkeyes, 38-0, and South Carolina finishing off a perfect season with a win in the national championship.
It's also fitting that it wasn't even South Carolina's stars. I mean, Camila Cardoso certainly 15 points, 17 rebounds, 3 blocks, had a significant impact on this game. But it was, as we've talked about before, the bench. It was Tessa Johnson having the best game of her career. It was what Mylasia Fulai was able to do. And I kind of want to start with this thought that you and I have talked about a little bit over text. And it should be noted that even Dawn Staley didn't think this team was going to get to this point. That's why she was so emotional right after the game. Was I don't think she saw this coming. Mm-hmm. She said they were too highly ranked even at the beginning of the season. I think they were 6th. But it is easy to, at least for me, to forget about this idea, right? You look at what teams are losing, and obviously this team lost an awful lot from last season. But what we can forget about is that for South Carolina, those players on the bench who don't get much playing time are really, really good too. They're just not quite as good as the players in front of them, who then go on to the WNBA and professional careers. And then Camila Cardoso becomes one of the best players in the country after being a backup last season because, oh, by the way, Aaliyah Boston was on the team.
Right.
And now you throw in Fulai and Tessa Johnson, your 2 freshmen, in addition to that next group of players who are now able to take that step and contribute. You rebuild the starting lineup, and they're a juggernaut again. Because it's not just that their starting 5 is as good as any team in the country. It's that Dawn Staley recruits players who understand, I'm not going to be a star from day one. If I want to average 20 a game, this is not where I should go. Mm-hmm. But if I want to develop and I want to be part of a culture where everybody is buying into doing what it takes to win and continue to build this program and take it from one group of players to the next, this is what you get, where this group that was certainly not as heralded as the other national championship teams picks up the pieces of the devastating loss last season and fittingly gets their revenge against Iowa in the national championship game. And it is just no doubt who the best team in the country was, even though nobody would have picked this heading into the season, even Dawn Staley.
Camila Cardoso, 9.8 points per game last year, 9.8, 8.5 rebounds.
I wouldn't even have thought it was that high.
She was 5.4 and 5.1 the year before. Interestingly enough, as a freshman, she was 13.6 and 8. Trivia time. Camila Cardoso in the most recent CBS Sports WNBA mock draft is the what overall pick?
4?
That's correct. 4. Behind Caitlin, Cameron Brink, Rakia Jackson, and then it's Camila Cardoso. And to your points, that's that wouldn't have been the case a year ago. And not only, it's one thing to become the best player on a team that's not a perfect team, right? It's a completely different thing to be a returner, but not a returning star necessarily, and turn yourself into a star, not only on a great basketball team, but one of the very best that we've seen recently in the game period. It's impressive stuff.
And they did, after that initial spurt from Iowa, they won this game by 22 points the rest of the way because it was 10-0, and Kate Martin was hitting shots, and you thought maybe, just maybe, Iowa's going to do this. And then Caitlin Clark went on a personal 8-0 run or something like that. And you thought maybe. And as soon as that momentum stopped and South Carolina kind of settled down and specifically went to their bench and kind of got order restored with what their bench did in this game. And, Caitlin starts missing some shots. Ultimately, it wasn't a spectacular. I mean, Kate Martin had 16. Hannah Stolke had some moments, but it's not like it was great. They got 0 points off the bench, which is the biggest story of this game, is that, it was the bench point discrepancy was laugh out loud funny.
But 18 minutes, it's not even like they just all had really bad shooting nights. It just was not. They're just the bench, as you called it. Tessa Johnson had more minutes by herself. There were 3 different South Carolina players that had just as many bench minutes as just as many minutes on their own as the entire Iowa bench.
Right. And so it just became clear in the second quarter, at least to me, okay, this is going to be at least a competitive basketball game, or South Carolina is going to run away with it. Iowa is not going to keep this up for 4 quarters. And, it was 30 points, 8 rebounds, 5 assists, 10 to 28 shooting. Rava Johnson played some really good defense on Caitlin at times. And ultimately, it wasn't enough because you didn't have, Hannah Stolke going for 40. You didn't have Clark going for 50, 10, and 10 or something like that. And the South Carolina just got, 4 players in double figures, another with 9, another with 7. Yeah, it was a fine performance from Iowa. It wasn't good enough defensively. They got hammered on the boards, which is what you expect. And South Carolina also shot 42% from 3. That's the other part of this, that the evolution from last season to this season, the fact that you bring in Tahina Pau, you bring in Tessa Johnson, that's 2 players who combined in this game went 6 of 10 from 3. They're a better shooting team this season than they were last season, if you want to point it to one specific thing as to why this team finished the job and last year's didn't. To me, that would be it. But it was 2 really good basketball teams, and one is just a little bit better than the other.
I think what you said about Iowa is accurate, that it's not like it was a bad Iowa game. It was I would have been surprised if Iowa beat South Carolina, because what we've seen over the last 5 months, 6 months, is that South Carolina is clearly the better basketball team. And even in this tournament, we saw things that we talked about on this podcast, the last couple months of the season, and some of the vulnerability that Iowa has when it takes Caitlin 28 shots to get 30 instead of 28 shots to get 46. And that's just, you have a little bit of a scare against West Virginia. You get through an LSU team that was a little underwhelming for large parts of the season, a UConn team that was, that was good but not great.
Would have won that game if they were full strength. I firmly believe that.
And you add that into the equation as well. I think, they made it this far because of, the ultimate equalizer, but at no point during this tournament or, in the calendar year of 2024, let's say, did I think, unless it was like all-time crazy, that I was going to beat South Carolina on a night where Caitlin Clark was just Caitlin Clark, which sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but there are some nights that even she, blows a normal night for Caitlin Clark out of the water, and this wasn't one of them.
No. There were a lot of long, questionable threes that didn't go in. There was one that did at the beginning, and that's where you think, okay, maybe it is going to be one of those nights where you just can't do anything. But ultimately, both this game and specifically the Final Four, these teams that have some of the best players in the country, right, that are high-level recruiters, Gino Auriemma, Dawn Staley, found players who were able to bother her a little bit. Specifically, the UConn game bothered her a lot. She bounced back in this one. I had every confidence in the world she was going to. You're just playing against a juggernaut. You're playing against a team that goes 9 deep. And all of them would start on just about any other team in the country. And they also have the motivation of feeling like they let last year's seniors down, of wanting to get revenge for losing to this Iowa team. There were just a lot of factors that were pointing in South Carolina's favor in this game, and they didn't panic early and just kind of systematically went to work.
Indeed. Congratulations, South Carolina. 87-75. Perfect season, national championship for the Gamecocks. Saturday night, inside, is it State Farm Stadium? Is that what it is nowadays? Is that right?
Yes.
It's in Glendale. It is State Farm Stadium. There you go.
Yes,
in
you are
Glendale. Let's start with the early game. Purdue, number 1 seed against number 11 seed NC State. 63-50, the final score. It wasn't pretty all the time. It wasn't pretty most of the time. But as I said to somebody once that game concluded, at the end of the day, it was an 11 seed that Purdue needed to beat to get to the national championship game, and they played well enough to beat an 11 seed. That's about as much props as I could give. But that's all you needed to do. On Saturday night, you needed to beat an 11 seed. It wouldn't have been good enough on a Monday night, but on a Saturday night when NC State makes it to the Final Four, it was good enough. Zach Edey 20, 12, and 4. It was a pretty rough Braden Smith game, more turnovers than points. But Fletcher Lawyer hit some big shots. Lance Jones had a nice shooting night. He and Lawyer 7 of 14 from the 3-point line combined. Mason Gillis with some solid minutes off the bench, 8 and 4 in 24 minutes. And it was enough to get a matchup with UConn on Monday night.
These are the games supposedly Purdue can't win in terms of, or at least struggles against these higher double-digit seeds. So I don't want people coming back now and saying, well, look, they didn't perform particularly great. It wasn't pretty. They won the game. They did their job. And yes, was that Braden Smith's worst game of the season? Probably. Maybe the worst game of his college career. And they still won. They also shot 40% from 3. That certainly helps. I'm not sure last year's team could have done that. To me, this is partly about they are more foolproof, or whatever term you want to use, more protected from the nights where the guards, and specifically Braden Smith, just can't take care of the basketball, because you're not getting that plus a bad shooting night probably. They hit 10 3-pointers. Zach Edey still exists. And defensively, they did a really good job against a team that they are significantly better than. Right. There's no applause to be handed out in terms of, oh my goodness, Purdue just looked fantastic. No, they were really bad. And they still won a Final Four game against a team that had to beat a bunch of teams to get here that was playing really good basketball. If I'm a Purdue fan, I'm looking at this from the perspective of it is really hard to go 6 games without having won. And we talk about this all the time, right? That it's not pretty. That to play really, really well for 6 straight games, it's incredibly difficult against the best teams in the country.
Mm-hmm.
You picked a pretty good time to have your stinker. Because, right, I don't think we need to have a discussion about this. If they show up and do that against UConn, they are not winning that game. So they got it out.
They might not win that game no matter what they do. But
right.
But they, it takes some, when you talk about the path to a national championship, it's not because the team that could potentially win a national championship can't win any of the 6 games they might need to play. Mm-hmm. It's about getting lucky.
Yep.
Getting it being an advantageous time that you have your not great game.
Instead of losing in horrendous fashion like they did against Virginia,
mm-hmm.
They came out on the right end. They were not playing as good of a team that they were set up to take advantage of, with Lance Jones being able to guard the perimeter, with Zach Edey being able to physically stand up to DJ Burns in a way not many people can.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that you now have a 6'9" guy trying to guard Zach Edey on the other end of the floor. Yeah. This is the evolution and maturation of Purdue I'm sure, talk final or championship game real quick at the end. But it says if you're going to criticize them all the times where these games don't go well and they lose these games, you also need to give them credit for finding a way to win when those things still happen. And they're playing a good basketball team with a trip to the national championship game on the line. They got the job done. There was no doubt who the better team was, even though Purdue, objectively, compared to their own standards, were terrible. That says something about how good this team is.
I don't have much more. I don't have much more to add there. 63-50, NC State. What was it? 9 games in a row that they won. That they absolutely had to have.
That, if I'm doing the math, that sounds right.
9, and all of them were elimination games. And at one point, they were down by 12 to Louisville in the first round of the ACC tournament. So the fact that their last game came on April 6th is tippable for sure. Nightcap, UConn, 86, Alabama, 72. Anybody who watched this game would tell you that it was not as comfortable as a 14-point win would suggest. In a lot of ways, Alabama got the night that they needed. In several different aspects. They got an excellent Mark Sears game. They got a great Grant Nelson game. They were 11 of 24 from the 3-point line, and still at the end of the day, it was too much UConn. And even though, I've talked a lot this tournament about, did you get the game that you needed so that hopefully on the right night you get a win? I felt like Alabama got the game they needed. It just wasn't an off UConn night. It's the UConn team we've seen for the last 6 months, and ultimately it was just a little bit too much. Stephon Castle, 21, the entire starting lineup in double figures. Stephon Castle leading the way with 21, Donovan Clingan 18, 5, and 4 blocks, that is, and just too much UConn making a trip to the national championship game for the second consecutive year.
When Alabama was shooting, what was it, 70% from 3 in the first half? 7 to 10.
They were 8 of 11 at halftime, I think.
Yeah, right. I think it's 7 to 10 at one point. Yeah, get up to 8 and 11, whatever it was, 70+% from 3, and they're still not winning the game.
Yeah,
that's where I went. They're in trouble because they had to do that for another 20 minutes to maybe have a chance. Right. And this was kind of what I expected, that they were going to show up, they were going to hit threes, they were going to play fairly well. Defensively, I mean, they gave up 86 points because they're not a great defensive team, but they were playing better defense in the tournament. They certainly weren't terrible defensively.
I didn't think so.
No, it was a respectable defensive performance. It's just not good enough to...
It's just the best offense in the country.
Right.
And not talking about Alabama.
Yeah. And it is so hard to... Everybody kept talking about the magic number was 15. Can they get to 15 threes? And again, they were making everything in the first half, and they were still basically on pace to get to 15. They hit 8. Mm-hmm. They don't have the ability on either end of the floor to play with UConn if UConn shows up. And so that's basically what happened in the second half, is eventually UConn just warmed down. And they stopped hitting all of the threes. They still shot the ball well. Not well enough if they needed to win this game, though, because, right, Stephon Castle was spectacular, and everybody else did their job. Tristan Newton had 9 assists. All 5 starters, 12-plus points. Tristan Newton scored the fewest of the 5 starters. That's never a good sign for the opposition.
Mm-hmm.
And Donovan Clingan was a problem, as he always is. I mean, to me, that was kind of the story of the Final Four. I'm really on both ends, both the men's and the women's side, is there were 2 teams that were clearly better than the 2 teams they were playing. They got the job done. Now they're going to meet, and we're going to see whether the team that's going to be the somewhat heavy underdog can pull off the upset, because we know they can. One of them has Caitlin Clark. One of them is Purdue, right? They can do this.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have a deserving national champion regardless. But the Final Four itself was just not very interesting on either end, because the teams that were better showed up and did what they were supposed to do.
It's in every single game, every UConn player has this moment where they look like the best player on the floor.
Yeah.
Like all 5 of them. Every single game. Whether it's, Stephon Castle right off the rip when they're like, wait, you're not going to guard me? Like
Okay.
I'm gonna be a lottery pick next year. Like, and you're not even gonna act like you're gonna guard me. Like, I understand that there's a lot to handle with Stephon Castle, and the thing you're gonna gamble with is the 3-point shot. Like, I get it, but still. And there were times where it was like, yeah, that's clearly the guy who's gonna get drafted
Yep.
highest in the NBA
He
draft
was
on
excellent.
on the floor right now.
Yeah.
And Cam Spencer doing the things that he does. Klingon gets a dunk on one end and then goes from the right elbow to the left block and a step to block a layup
Yeah.
from a guy that's been beat. Carabin locking down a dude for 2 straight possessions and then hits a 3 basically from the logo. Like, it's just it's so overwhelming. It's got to be impossible to play them. There's just so much that you have to worry about, and at some point, which is what Tristan Newton said after the game, that at some point we're just going to break you. Like, at some point it's going to happen. And credit to Alabama, they made it a good 34 minutes or so.
Yeah. They did better than anybody else has so far.
Before they really started to crack. And that's just what they do, even when the other team gets, in a lot of ways, gets the night that they needed.
Yep. And this can kind of be our transition into predictions for tomorrow night's finale. And this was kind of what we were talking about before this game too, that I don't feel like you can beat UConn using a formula. You can't do it by imposing your will or your game plan on them. You have to be able to match them physically, from a talent perspective, at least for those 40 minutes, right? Top to bottom, they're the most talented, best team in the country. Nobody's disputing that. But I feel like Purdue has the pieces on the right night to actually match up and go toe-to-toe with them. And the one thing that's notable here is, not necessarily in this game, but UConn hasn't shot the ball particularly well in this tournament. If Purdue shoots the ball well and Zach Edey does Zach Edey things and gets the better of Klingon, I see a way for this to happen.
I've been a big Braden Smith and Purdue backcourt in general supporter the last 24 months or so, the last 18 months. And I think Braden Smith, like maybe Tristan Newton, but like from a point guard perspective, like in the things that a traditional point guard does. And I say that to say to kind of exclude guys like Mark Sears. It's not really what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But he's been as rock solid as you can ask a guy who holds the ball, who has the ball in his hands so much. Like, I'm not sure what else you could want. A bad night on Saturday, obviously, but every time I watch UConn play, or if I ever watch UConn like at 4:00 on a Saturday and I watch Purdue at 7:00 on a Saturday, like, Braden Smith probably has nightmares about Tristan Newton and Alex Carabin and Cam Spencer. I can't think, like, in Stephon, like the length
all of them.
The length that UConn has on the perimeter just feels like the thing that's going to decide the game is not who's better between Klingon and Edey. It's can Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer do enough, whether it's Braden with the ball in his hands, Fletcher getting open, Lance Jones having a little stretch like he does in a lot of games. It just feels like UConn has all of the physical features to just make things so difficult for that backcourt. And maybe I'll be wrong. Maybe they'll handle it flawlessly. And it's not even me predicting that the Purdue backcourt's gonna shatter and the foundation of them will crash against UConn. That's not really what I'm saying. It just feels like that asking Edey to have to be so much better than Klingon, when I think that collectively the UConn perimeter is just so much better and has the right type of talent to make it so difficult for Purdue's perimeter. That's the part of the court I'll be most interested in. A lot of people are going to be staring under the basket. I think I'll know in 4 minutes whether or not Purdue actually has a chance to win the game. It's going to be how it feels like they're handling what UConn brings to the perimeter in the first 4 to 5 minutes of the game.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. That is that is the game. Because it's not like UConn has no answer to who guards Zach Edey, right? It's not a 6'9" guy.
Mm-hmm.
Klingon is about as equipped as any. Klingon might be the single most equipped player in the country to guard Zach Edey. Does that mean he can stop him? No. But is he at least going to bother him? You would think so. Because he's got all the physical characteristics to do so. The question is, can Purdue's guards handle this? Are they up for the challenge? And part of me thinks because Braden Smith had such a stinker, he is going to be excellent in this game. That's what my gut says, is that Purdue is going to show up and this is going to be really close. And maybe that's just me being an optimistic person who picked Purdue from the beginning of the season to win the championship and isn't backing down from that.
Sure.
But I am right there with you. That is the story of this game. Those guards have to, because I do think Edey will get probably a slight advantage inside. Those guards have to be close to equal. If you throw, the role players plus Lance Jones plus the two, Lawyer and Smith, those guys have to be comparable to what UConn is going to get from all of those guard wing guys who are so good. And yeah, maybe they get blitzed like Duke did against Houston and then regroup and find a way. But you're asking for a lot if you bury yourself early against UConn. They've got to be ready to go from the tip. And I do think those first 4 minutes are going to be huge, just from a confidence standpoint of Braden Smith and Fletcher Loyer. I'm like, okay, we can do this. We navigated it. We know what this feels like now. Get a couple shots to fall early, make a couple plays. Because, yeah, UConn has the luxury of nothing has to go particularly right for them to win, right? They just show up and have a really good chance to win because something is going to happen. Like you said, at any point, any of their 5 starters could be the best player on the floor for a 2-3 minute stretch. Mm-hmm. Purdue has to have a couple things go right in this game. And to me, that is the backcourt being productive and taking care of the basketball, and they got to make threes. Mm-hmm. Because if we can go, player to player and say UConn's got the better roster, that's true. The one spot where Purdue is better, I feel like, outside of Edey being better than Klingon, which you can have your conversations about that because of what Klingon brings defensively. I'll still take Edey. Regardless, the one clear advantage Purdue has is the 3-point shooting. Yeah. To me, that is the one thing they have where you go, they got to lean into that. They got to capitalize on that and hope UConn has a bad shooting night. Because I do feel like if UConn has a bad shooting night, if Edey is great, and if the backcourt does its job, this is a really, really close basketball game. And Purdue, what happens when UConn is actually under pressure in the last couple minutes? Because we haven't got there yet. Nate Oates tried to convince his team that they could and brought that point up in a huddle, and they didn't get there. Mm-hmm. What happens when this UConn team, this will kind of be my final thought. Do we get to a point where this UConn team that is being told by their coach, nobody can play with you for 40 minutes. You will break every team you play. We will destroy everyone. What happens if this Purdue team shows up and says that's not true? Doesn't mean Purdue's going to win. But how does UConn respond to that part if they actually get in a dogfight and can't settle it in 30, 35 minutes like they've done in every other single game this tournament?
Yeah. For what it's worth, that's not a Purdue can't handle it. Yeah. That's just a will Purdue handle it.
And a Purdue has to handle it in order to win. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
I'm picking Purdue, by the way.
I'm picking UConn. Mostly because I picked UConn to win this tournament 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
There's, you can pick a winner of the game based on where your money is, where your heart is, and where your head is. My heart is with the Fighting Matt Painters. My head is still with that UConn team because Dan Hurley might be aggressive in communicating that. But we've got a massive sample size that suggests that he is correct when he tells them that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And
we'll see.
I said this before the tournament. If there's one guy I want trying to coach this team to do this and repeat as national champions when everybody is coming at you, it's Dan Hurley. No doubt about it, for that exact reason.
Monday night. We'll be back after it to talk about it. Of course, it wouldn't be the last college basketball game of the season when it's a standalone game that doesn't start until 9:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So we'll be back at an ungodly hour to talk about it on Monday evening. I think that's going to do it. Under 8 podcast. April 7th in 30 minutes. You know how we do. April 7th, 7:11 p.m. That's going to do it. We'll be back tomorrow. Please subscribe to the Under 8 podcast. Wherever you listen to your shows, follow the Under 8 pod on Twitter, subscribe on YouTube. Thanks so much for being here. We will see you tomorrow.